Some people got their nursing degrees online, and it shows. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before a military convoy surrounded his hospital. Rachel Torres moves through St. Michael's Hospital in Houston like a shadow. 3 months as a temp nurse, always early, always precise, folding linens with creases sharp enough to cut. The fluorescent lights hum above her as she inventories medications in the supply closet, her movements economical, surgical. A faint scar runs along her left forearm, visible when she reaches for the top shelf. She doesn't pause when she sees it. Pain is information. Scars are just old data. The hospital smells like antiseptic and stale coffee and something underneath, the particular copper salt tang of a place where bodies fail and people make peace with it. Rachel breathes it in like most people breathe air. She's worked in worse places. Much worse. But Dr. Whitfield doesn't know that. Nobody knows that. She clips her badge to her scrubs. The laminate catches the fluorescent light. Temporary staff. 3 months into what she's been told is a routine rotation at St. Michael's, and the badge still feels like a costume she hasn't quite settled into wearing. She's worn other uniforms, heavier ones that meant something different, but this light blue scrub top carries its own weight. Different kind of armor. Different kind of mission. The emergency department is controlled chaos this morning. A 6-car pileup on I-10 has filled 3 trauma bays. Rachel moves through the controlled frenzy without hurrying. Hurrying is panic. Panic kills people. She helps transfer a patient with a fractured tibia to orthopedics, her hands steady as surgical instruments, her voice quiet and calm. We've got you. Left side on 3. One of the ER techs, Marcus, glances at her as they wheel the stretcher down the corridor. You ever get rattled? He asks. Not in public, she says. It's not quite a joke. Not quite the truth either. But that wasn't the worst part of the morning. Around 9:15, Dr. Whitfield appears in the nursing station with 2 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. He's wearing a suit that costs more than Rachel's monthly rent, and he wears it the way some men wear weapons, like an advertisement of power. His hair is silver and perfectly cut. His watch is the kind that requires an appointment to repair. Torres, he says, and her name in his mouth sounds like an accusation. You're taking room 347. Rachel nods. What's the admission? Special Forces veteran. Deaf. Tikrit deployment, 72 months ago. Presenting with precardiac symptoms. Whitfield pauses, and she can see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He's been through 4 hospitals. 20 doctors have declined to take his case. 20. The number sits in the air like a challenge. 20 doctors, he repeats, watching her face. You understand what that means? Communication barriers. Liability concerns. Complex medical history we don't have full documentation on. He leans against the desk. Some people got their nursing degrees online, and it shows. I'm guessing you can handle a straightforward admission and vitals. The 2 residents look at their feet. Rachel says nothing. Her jaw doesn't clench, that's not how she operates. Instead, she feels the familiar sensation of her nervous system downshifting, like a sniper taking a breath before the shot. The trembling some people feel in response to insults, she's learned to channel into pure focus. Her mother used to call it having ice water in her veins. Her commanding officers called it operational clarity. Room 347, she confirms. I'll get his baseline. She doesn't wait for a response. She moves through the hospital corridors with the kind of quiet efficiency that makes people forget they've seen you. That's the point. That's always been the point. Invisible. Present. Available. The kind of operative who can stand in a room for 3 months without anyone asking a single substantive question about her past or her credentials. Room 347 is at the end of the East Corridor, where the light from the windows turns the linoleum the color of weak tea. The man sitting on the hospital bed is lean and muscled in the way of people who understand that their bodies are instruments that can fail them. His face bears the geometric precision of someone who has survived trauma. His eyes are sharp and present. He's deaf, she can see that in the specific quality of his attention, the way he reads the room through visual information rather than sound. His brother stands beside the bed, a man in his mid-40s with the same military bearing, the same careful posture. On the bedside table sits a single possession, a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked and faded to the color of old dirt. The laces are frayed. The soles are worn thin. They look like they've walked through 200 meters of open ground under fire. Possibly more than that. "I'm Rachel," she signs as she approaches, her hands moving through American Sign Language with the precision she learned years ago, in a different context, in a different uniform. Her hands say, "I will help." The veteran's eyes shift to focus on her hands, and something changes in his face. Recognition, maybe. Or relief. She's not sure which. His brother speaks. "We've been to 4 hospitals. Nobody wants to treat him. They say they can't communicate. They say the liability is too high." He sounds tired. The kind of tired that comes from fighting the same battle over and over. "Thank you for taking him." Rachel sets down her assessment clipboard. Her hands are steady. "What's his name?" "Diego Reyes. Master Chief, actually. 12 years of service, 3 combat deployments, one of them in Tikrit." The brother pauses. "He was a SEAL. Medical specialist. He knows what's happening to his body. He just needs someone who will listen." Master Chief Diego Reyes. The rank hits her like recognition between people who speak the same language. She signs to him, "Your vitals." "Let me check." His hands respond, "Thank you for trying." She takes his vital signs with practiced efficiency. Blood pressure 128/82. Heart rate elevated at 96, slightly irregular. Oxygen saturation at 94%. Respirations at 18. Her hands move through the process, the blood pressure cuff, the pulse oximeter, the thermometer, like she's performed this 10,000 times, which she has, though not in this context. She documents everything precisely. The medical chart needs to reflect her assessment completely. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Every number exact, every observation clinical. That's when Dr. Whitfield appears in the doorway. He's watching her, and she can feel the weight of his attention the way she's learned to feel the weight of surveillance through glass walls and camera feeds. His expression hasn't changed, but something in his posture tightens. He's observing her interaction with the patient, measuring something. Testing her, maybe. Or testing the limits of whatever he thinks he knows about her. Rachel continues her assessment without acknowledging his presence. She checks Diego's pupils with a penlight, equal, round, reactive to light. She listens to his lungs with her stethoscope, clear bilaterally. No crackles. No wheezes. She takes her time because time is a tool. She is not rattled. She is not bothered by Whitfield's presence. She is simply a temp nurse doing her job. When she's finished, she signs to Diego, "Rest. I will monitor." He nods. His hands move, "You served." It's not a question. He's reading something in her movements, in the precision of her technique. Or maybe in the way she carries herself when she thinks nobody important is watching. Military people recognize other military people. They can smell it on each other like some kind of pheromone only the trained can detect. Rachel doesn't confirm or deny. She simply signs, "Get some rest. I'll be back." She turns to the bedside table and sees the worn combat boots sitting there like a relic. She picks them up gently, as if they're a religious object, which in some contexts they might as well be. The leather is warm in her hands. The boots have weight. History. She can practically feel the miles encoded in the worn heel, the cracked sole, the way the laces have frayed and been retied 100 times. She places them neatly beside the bed, aligned perfectly with the bed frame, at an angle that makes them visible from where Diego is resting. They're his only possession in this room. His anchor. She understands anchors. She's learned, over the course of 12 years and 3 combat deployments and 17 operations across 5 continents, that the things you carry say more about who you are than anything you say about yourself. Dr. Whitfield is still standing in the doorway. He hasn't moved. His eyes are following her hands as they position the boots, watching the care she takes. His expression hasn't changed, but something is happening behind his eyes. Calculation. Reassessment. Or maybe just the beginning of something that will take months to fully understand. Rachel walks past him without meeting his gaze. She doesn't need to. She's learned to navigate spaces where power is distributed unequally, where some people have more access to information and resources and institutional leverage than others. She's learned to move through those spaces like water, present but not present, visible but not seen. The hallway is quiet except for the distant hiss of ventilators and the soft beeping of monitors. The sounds of a place where lives are held together by machinery and chemistry and the accumulated expertise of people who have learned to work against the body's tendency to fail. Rachel returns to the nurse's station and updates Diego's chart. 20 doctors have said no. 20 times, someone in a white coat has looked at a deaf man in a hospital bed and decided the complexity wasn't worth the effort. 20 times, the system has failed. She wonders, briefly, if this is why she's actually here. Not the official reason. Not the operation she was briefed on 6 months ago. But this, the small, quiet refusals, the way institutions fail the people they're supposed to help, the gaps that open up when people in power decide something is too difficult. But that thought is dangerous. That thought requires her to acknowledge information she's not supposed to have. That thought requires her to admit that she's here for reasons that have nothing to do with being a temp nurse at St. Michael's Hospital. She clips her badge back to her scrubs and returns to the work that needs doing. There are medications to inventory. There are other patients who need care. There is a system that requires her to be present and competent and unremarkable. There is a pair of worn combat boots sitting beside a hospital bed, and a man who was refused by 20 doctors, and a temp nurse who just said yes. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The Grand Rounds amphitheater at St. Michael's filled with the sound of chairs scraping tile as residents claimed their seats. 234 chairs in tiered rows, and Rachel stood at the front of the room like someone waiting for a firing squad she'd volunteered for. The ceiling hung low with fluorescent panels that hummed their electric song, and the air smelled of coffee and antiseptic and the particular staleness that comes from a room where important people make important decisions about unimportant people. Dr. Whitfield stood at the podium. He wore a tie the color of old money and a smile that had been practiced in mirrors for decades. Behind him, the screen displayed Rachel's patient chart in 16-point font. Diego Reyes. Master Chief. Deaf. Refused by exactly 20 physicians across 4 hospitals in the greater Houston area. 20. That number glowed on the screen like an accusation. This case, Whitfield began, his voice carrying the confident acoustics of a man who had never been questioned in his own institution, represents a dangerous precedent. A deviation from protocol that, if left unchecked, will compromise this hospital's accreditation standing with the Joint Commission. He gestured toward Rachel without looking at her, as if she were a specimen under glass. Nurse Torres, our 3-month temporary staff member, has unilaterally accepted a patient that 20, count them, 20, qualified physicians deemed inappropriate for our facility. Rachel's jaw tightened. Imperceptibly. The kind of tightening that only someone who'd held a rifle for 8 years could execute without visible tremor. Whitfield continued, warming to his subject. She has no specialized training in ASL interpretation. No certification in high-risk patient advocacy. No understanding of institutional liability. And apparently no grasp of the clinical judgment exercised by board-certified surgeons far more experienced than herself. He paused, letting silence pool like blood. Perhaps Nurse Torres can explain to us what medical school taught her to override the judgment of 20 attending physicians. Resident scribbled notes. Pen scratched paper. No one looked at Rachel. The silence was the kind that comes just before something breaks. Rachel's voice, when it came, was flat as a surgical tray. "I attended the patient, doctor. That's what nurses do." She didn't raise her hand. Didn't request permission to speak. Simply stated fact the way you'd state the patient's blood type. The response carried no defensive edge, no apology, no explanation. Just the observation that while 20 doctors had walked away, one nurse had walked in. And she'd stayed. Whitfield's smile tightened. He'd expected tears, or defensiveness, or the kind of stammering that gives power brokers satisfaction. Instead, he got a temp nurse standing in parade rest, her spine straight as a corpsman's, her eyes looking at nothing and everything simultaneously. He moved on, but the victory he'd anticipated felt incomplete, like a surgical incision that wouldn't bleed the way it should. By 2 o'clock, Rachel stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. Her fingers punched the code for black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and the machine whirred its mechanical complaint before dispensing a cup into the tray. The machine smelled like hot plastic and recycled air. Outside the window 3 floors down, Houston sprawled under October heat that bent the air into visible waves. 2 residents leaned against the wall 10 feet away. Close enough to carry conversation. Far enough to claim deniability. "I'm just saying," one of them laughed, his voice deliberately pitched to travel. "You can get nursing degrees from basically anywhere now. Those online mills don't care. You could get one between a nail salon and a payday loan place." His colleague snorted. "Torres probably has one laminated on her apartment wall next to her TikTok makeup tutorials." They both laughed the laugh of people who'd never been refused anything important, never been humiliated in front of 200 doctors, never stood in a room where the air pressure felt like it was going to collapse their sternum. Rachel lifted her coffee cup from the dispenser. Her hands were absolutely steady. The kind of steady that comes from having held field sutures in a Humvee, from having applied pressure to wounds while artillery rounds walked closer, from having learned that trembling was a luxury only people with options could afford. She didn't turn toward the residents. Didn't acknowledge them. Her face remained neutral, not angry, not hurt, not defiant. Just empty of a need for their approval. She walked back toward room 347 without breaking stride. Dr. Whitfield stood near the water cooler, a paper cup of filtered water in his hand, and he watched her leave. His smile was small and satisfied. He'd planned this. The grand round's humiliation. The residents' mockery. The vending machine conversation arranged through a casual word to the surgical coordinator, who'd mentioned it to a resident, who'd mentioned it to a friend. The machinery of institutional power grinding forward, grinding downward, grinding until the temporary staff member understood her place in the hierarchy. 20 doctors had been smart enough to refuse this case. One temp nurse had been foolish enough to accept it. Whitfield would teach her the difference between courage and delusion. The lesson was already in motion. Inside room 347, the deaf veteran lay on his hospital bed. His vital signs were stable. His pre-surgical blood work was scheduled for tomorrow. His pair of worn combat boots sat on a chair near the window, the only possession he'd brought from Tikrit besides the scars and the silence. Rachel lifted the boots carefully. They were old, cracked leather the color of dust from somewhere overseas. The soles were worn into the shape of his feet, each footfall preserved in creases and impressions. She'd held enough hands to know that objects carry memory in a way skin cannot. These boots held Tikrit. They held deployments. They held the walks his feet had taken through corridors where doors kept slamming shut. She placed them neatly beside his bed, adjusting them until they were perfectly parallel to each other, perfectly aligned with the edge of the mattress. Not decorative. Not sentimental. Just ordered. The way a soldier orders things. The way you order things when chaos is the default state and discipline is the only rebellion available. The veteran watched her arrange his boots. He couldn't hear her, but he could see her hands moving with the precision of someone who understood that small gestures carried weight. That placing boots beside a bed was an act of declaration. That staying when 20 others had left was a form of warfare all its own. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Whitfield. The worst part came that evening when he reviewed the surgical schedule. The deaf veteran was listed for cardiac valve repair in 48 hours. A routine procedure. High stakes, but routine. Whitfield summoned the surgical coordinator, a woman named Helen who'd worked St. Michael's for 17 years and had learned to recognize the particular tone of voice that meant a physician was about to cause problems. "I want a resident team on the Reyes case," Whitfield said. "Not a request. A command phrased as preference. Not our senior surgeons. Residents. And Nurse Torres is not to be in that operating room. Not anywhere near it. Assign her to post-op recovery. Somewhere where she can't interfere with actual surgical care." Helen hesitated. She'd been a surgical nurse for 2 decades before coordination, and she knew the calculus of hospital politics. But she also knew that Rachel Torres had moved with the efficiency of someone trained in trauma medicine. She'd seen the way the veteran's brother had watched Rachel insert the fur earlier that afternoon, the way his expression had shifted from protective to something else. Curious. Recognizant. But Helen said nothing of this. "She's been the primary nurse for the entire admission," Helen offered. "Continuity of care would suggest." Did I stutter? Whitfield's voice had the texture of a blade being sharpened. "She's a temporary staff member with delusions of medical competence. She stays out of that operating room. This is not a negotiation." Helen nodded and left his office. Whitfield picked up his desk phone and dialed the chief nursing officer. When she answered, his voice carried the tone of institutional concern. "I need to report a serious performance issue with one of your temporary staff. Nurse Torres. There have been multiple incidents of protocol deviation, inadequate clinical reasoning, and frankly, reckless patient advocacy that's putting our accreditation at risk. I'm requesting she be placed under formal observation. Full written performance evaluation. I'm concerned about her background, her training, her entire trajectory." He listened to the response, nodded as if the other person could see him. "Yes. Exactly. Thank you. I believe this is the right call." He hung up the phone and returned his attention to the surgical schedule, satisfied. The machinery was in motion now. 20 doctors had walked away from Diego Reyes. In 48 hours, Rachel Torres would walk away too. That's how systems protected themselves. That's how power maintained order. That's how institutions broke people who forgot they were temporary, replaceable, nothing but contract workers in a hierarchy where surgeons were gods and nurses were functionaries and certain patients were simply too complicated to save. Whitfield stood and walked to his window overlooking Houston. The city sprawled beneath him, all those lives moving in all those directions, and none of them aware that the decisions that would change them were being made by men in offices, in amphitheaters, in quiet conversations by water coolers and vending machines. He'd learned long ago that victory didn't require confrontation. It required patience. It required understanding how power flowed through institutions like blood through veins. And it required knowing that temporary people always left eventually. Either by choice or by force. But what Whitfield didn't know was that Rachel had already made her call too. The evening before surgery, Rachel moved through the patient's room with the kind of quiet efficiency that made the work look simple. Diego Reyes sat propped against 3 pillows, his massive frame still somehow diminished by the hospital bed, his deaf eyes tracking every movement she made. She'd learned that about him in 3 days, his eyes never stopped working, reading the room like sonar. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that constant hospital drone that most people stopped hearing after 5 minutes. Rachel never stopped hearing it. It was information. Everything was information. She gathered the 4 supplies with hands that had done this 10,000 times across 3 continents. 18-gauge catheter. Saline lock. Alcohol prep pad that smelled sharp and chemical, cutting through the antiseptic fog of the room. Diego watched her organize the supplies on the bedside table with the precision of someone laying out surgical instruments. He knew what was coming. He'd had 4s before. But something in her movements made him lean forward slightly, his expression shifting from resignation to something closer to curiosity. "This won't hurt," Rachel said, making sure he was looking at her face. She'd learned that too. Diego read lips better than most people heard, and she'd stopped speaking without establishing eye contact. Not as a courtesy. As a necessity. "But I need your arm relaxed. Can you do that?" Diego nodded and extended his left arm, the forearm scarred in patterns that Rachel recognized instantly. Blast fragmentation. The scars weren't random, they told a story of someone who'd shielded something or someone from a concussive blast. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. The tourniquet went on just above his elbow, elastic and snug but not cutting. Rachel's fingers moved to locate the vein. The median cubital vein running down the center of his forearm was perfect, prominent and stable. She prepped the site with the alcohol pad, let it dry for exactly 5 seconds. The smell of antiseptic rose sharply. She could feel Diego watching her, not his arm but her hands. The way a patient watched when they'd learned to read competence in someone's movements instead of their words. Rachel held the catheter between her thumb and forefinger, the needle gleaming under the overhead light, and approached the vein at a 45-degree angle. Most nurses went straight in. She went shallow first, a technique from forward operating bases where you didn't have time to miss and couldn't afford to bleed the patient dry into a field dressing. She advanced the needle until she felt the subtle giver breaking through the vein wall. The flashback of blood filled the chamber instantly. Good. Then came the part most nurses didn't bother with. She rotated the catheter counterclockwise before advancing it fully into the vein. A quarter turn. Just enough to minimize nerve damage, to give the vein room to breathe around the foreign object sitting inside it. It was a small thing. The kind of thing that would save him from thrombophlebitis, from nerve pain that would last for weeks, from the kind of subtle damage that most people forgot to prevent because they were in a hurry. Diego's breath caught. She withdrew the needle, secured the catheter with a clear dressing, flushed the line with saline. The work of 30 seconds, executed with a kind of precision that belonged in an operating room, not a patient bedside. She stepped back, tape secure, line locked. That's when Diego's brother stood up from the corner chair where he'd been sitting silently for the past hour. Marcus Reyes. Also military. Also marked by it in ways that went deeper than scars. He moved across the room like something caught between two different worlds, and he froze directly beside Rachel, his eyes locked on her hands, on the foresight, on the technique she'd just performed. "Where did you learn to do it that way?" His voice was barely above a whisper. He wasn't asking out of casual curiosity. He was asking the way a combat medic asks when he sees someone do something they shouldn't know how to do. Rachel met his eyes. Held them. The moment stretched long enough to be dangerous. She could see the recognition trying to form in his face, the pieces of something starting to connect. She'd made a mistake. A small one. A precise one. The kind of mistake that came from training you didn't forget, from muscle memory that ran deeper than cover stories. Trauma rotation, she said, her voice level and flat. They teach you unconventional techniques at big level 1 centers. Especially when patients come through with compromised veins. You adapt. She turned slightly, breaking the eye contact, letting the moment collapse. Your brother should rest. Surgery is early tomorrow. Marcus didn't move. She could feel him processing, the way his jaw worked silently. Then Diego raised his hand, caught his brother's attention, and signed something too quick for Rachel to follow. Marcus's expression shifted, something like acceptance, or at least the decision to let it go. He settled back into the chair. But his eye stayed on Rachel for the rest of the evening, measuring her in a way that made it clear he knew she'd just told him a truth and a lie simultaneously, stacked on top of each other like shrapnel. Surgery day arrived gray and humid. Houston in September felt like breathing through wet cloth. Rachel reported to St. Michael's at 5 in the morning, the parking lot still dark enough to see the stars dying out. She'd worn scrubs instead of her usual street clothes, a choice that would have drawn questions if anyone had asked. No one asked. The night shift was wrapping up, staff moving like ghosts through the corridors. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm from various rooms. Somewhere in the building, monitors beeped their endless low pulse. She found her assignment posted on the surgical board: post-op recovery, observation rotation. Not the operating room itself, Whitfield had made sure of that. But the observation gallery overlooked surgical suite 3, the glass-sealed and professional, where she could watch everything without being in the way. Without being useful. It was a small cruelty, the kind of strategic move that competent people made instead of crude ones. She was shut out but not gone. She was forced to witness but not permitted to act. Rachel climbed to the gallery level at 6:30, before the surgical teams arrived. The observation room was empty except for the fluorescent glare and the sterile smell of hospitals at rest. The glass that overlooked Suite 3 was crystal clear, and she could see the surgical team already setting up below, a nurses positioning instruments on the tray, the orthopedic surgeon prepping the room, the anesthesiologist checking her cart with the methodical precision of someone who understood that mistakes here killed people. Dr. Whitfield arrived at 6:58, exactly on time, and he carried with him the kind of composed fury that only comes from knowing you've already won. He moved through the surgical suite like he was inspecting property, and when his gaze swept across the empty gallery, Rachel saw his face relax slightly. Good. She was watching. But she couldn't touch. The perfect position for her to understand her own irrelevance. The pre-op team wheeled Diego into the suite at 7:03. He was conscious, sedated but aware. His eyes moved across the ceiling, across the lights, taking in the space the way soldiers do: exits, threats, angles. Rachel watched him see her through the gallery glass. Just for a moment. His eyes locked on hers, and then a nurse was placing the oxygen mask over his face, and his world narrowed to what was immediately in front of him. The anesthesiologist began her count from 10. By 5, Diego was gone. The draping began. Surgical site prep. The incision was marked with a skin marker, a straight line that represented the difference between Diego staying alive and Diego becoming a name in a chart. Whitfield supervised while a second-year resident, a woman named Chen, Rachel remembered from grand rounds, made the first cut. The scalpel moved with hesitation. First big case, maybe. The kind where your hands aren't completely sure yet that they have the authority to cut into living flesh. The monitors showed steady rhythm. 103 beats per minute. Respiration controlled by the ventilator at 12 breaths per minute. Blood pressure solid at 148/92. The procedure was supposed to take 2 hours. Straightforward fixation of the femoral fracture. Pins, plate, closure. 3 days of observation. Discharge to physical therapy. Normal. 30 minutes in, the monitors changed their song. The heart rate spiked first, 120, 130, 140. The blip on the monitor accelerated from a steady rhythm into something erratic. Rachel felt her own body go still. She'd seen this before. In Tikrit, in a field hospital made of sandbags and determination. In Kandahar, in a facility with better equipment but the same helpless moment when things turned. Arrhythmia, the anesthesiologist called out, her voice sharp but controlled. Sustained run. He's going into VTAC. Whitfield's head snapped up. Correct it. 200 joules, defibrillate now. The monitor showed the rhythm attempting to defibrillate, showed the flat line, showed the pause that lasted a lifetime. Then the rhythm came back wrong. Ventricular fibrillation. The heart had stopped working as a pump and started vibrating uselessly, like a hummingbird's wings with no purpose. The patient was no longer being perfused. In the absence of intervention, he had perhaps for minutes. Maybe 5. He's in full arrest, Chen said, panic rising in her voice like a tide. Paddles, we need internal. Step back, Whitfield ordered, and Chen's hands withdrew from the open chest. Whitfield moved to the table, and Rachel watched his hands position over the exposed heart. The internal defibrillation paddles were ready. He applied them to the heart tissue, anterior and posterior walls, and she could see the problem immediately. The contact was wrong. The angle was off. The placement was fighting the natural tissue plane instead of working with it. 40 joules, internal, he commanded. The defibrillator discharged. The heart seized and spasmed. The monitor showed nothing but noise. Whitfield kept his eyes on the device, waiting for it to reset. And that's when Rachel moved. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who had the luxury of time. She was through the gallery door in 2 steps, her hands were already tearing off her jacket in the hallway. She was at the surgical sink scrubbing in with an intensity that turned her hands red within 5 seconds. The cold water bit into her skin. The surgical soap smelled like iodine and determination. She was gloved and masked and pushing through the operating room doors before anyone could question her presence, before anyone could stop her, before the moment where authority would have told her to stand down. The suit felt right. The latex gloves like a second skin. She'd spent 18 years inside operating rooms, and the smell of cauterized flesh and open blood had become something like home. Whitfield's face turned purple. "Get her out of here." "She's not authorized." Rachel was already at the table. She didn't even look at him. Diego's chest was open, the surgical field stark white under the overhead lights. The heart was visible and spasming uselessly, a muscular thing that had lost the plot, and she placed both hands directly into the cavity, her fingers finding the ventricles, and began direct cardiac massage. The pressure was firm but controlled. Rhythm. Compression. Release. Rhythm. Epi, 1 milligram, for push, right now, she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The anesthesiologist stared at her for exactly 1 second, then moved. A nurse scrambled for the epinephrine. The drug went in. Rachel kept the compression steady. 40 beats per minute, mechanical but alive. The heart began to respond beneath her fingers. Paddles internal, 40 joules, posterior and anterior placement, Rachel said, and she knew from the way the room moved, that something had shifted. She was no longer the temp nurse from the observation gallery. She was the person saving the patient's life. Now. The anesthesiologist had the paddles ready. Rachel withdrew her hands from the chest cavity, and the paddles went in, and the discharge hit, and the monitor recorded it, and the heart rhythm came back wrong, and Rachel went back in, hands finding the muscle, finding the pulse, finding the work. 2 more rounds. 2 more discharges. By the 3rd one, the sinus rhythm returned, steady, strong, present. The heart was working again. The room went dead silent. The heart was warm and slick under her fingers. 30 seconds of compressions. The ribs flexed beneath her palms like a bird struggling against capture. 60 seconds. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her hands never wavered, steady as surgical steel, steady as someone who had done this before in places where there were no monitors, no backup, no room for hesitation. "Charge to 200, she called out, her voice dropping an octave, the timid temp nurse evaporating mid-sentence. "Clear." The shock delivered. The body arched. Nothing on the monitor but flat line. The attending surgeon stood frozen 3 feet away, his hands at his sides, his face the color of old bone. He had stepped back the moment the arrest began. Just step back. Rachel's eyes flicked to him once, a single glance that said everything, then returned to the work. Again. 250 joules. The defibrillator pads crackled. The charge delivered. The heart shuddered under her hands like something waking from the dead. And then, a single beat. Then another. A rhythm bloomed across the monitor screen, normal sinus rhythm, steady and true, climbing back from nothing like a man climbing out of a grave. The room exhaled. Nurses gasped. A resident's hands trembled. Rachel didn't stop. "Warm saline irrigation," she called out. "Check for clot formation. Prepare pacing wires. We're closing." The resident moved mechanically, still in shock that a temporary nurse had just brought a man back from the edge of eternity. Rachel's hands guided the closure with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory so deep it lives in the bone. 300 combat deployments across 2 theaters. 17 years since her last civilian hospital. Her body had not forgotten a single second. Dr. Whitfield's voice cracked like a whip. "Everybody out. Now." The team dispersed like water breaking apart. Whitfield pointed at Rachel, his face mottled with something beyond anger, something closer to the panic of a man watching his kingdom fracture. "You are done. Security." She was still wearing her surgical gloves. Blood covered them to the wrists. She pulled them off slowly, never breaking eye contact with him, and dropped them into the biohazard bin. The gesture was dismissive. Deliberately. He saw it. His jaw tightened. 2 security guards appeared within minutes, moving with the cautious energy of men who had been summoned to something they didn't understand. Whitfield's voice rose loud enough for the entire surgical floor to hear, nurses in the hallway, residents at the station, interns frozen mid-step. Nurse Torres has violated sterile protocol, entered an operating room without authorization, and interfered with an active surgical procedure. Deactivate her badge. She is to leave the premises immediately. His words were a death sentence delivered in front of witnesses. Rachel removed her surgical cap. Yanked the tie that had held her hair back. Her face remained absolutely blank, no anger, no fear, no humiliation. Just the calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could do. Because she knew the truth that Whitfield would never understand, he thought he was firing a nurse. He was firing a Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy. He was firing a SEAL medical specialist who had saved more lives than he had treated in his entire career. She was here undercover. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, call sign Valkyrie 6, placed 6 months ago to monitor a suspected medical fraud ring tied to veteran benefits falsification. Falsified surgical billing on vulnerable patients. Elderly veterans. Disabled veterans. Men and women whose service had already cost them everything. The trail led directly through St. Michael's accounting department and radiated outward through supply chain manipulation and false billing codes. She had been gathering evidence. Photographs of forged documents. Audio recordings of conversations. Bank transfers. And if she revealed her actual identity now, if she allowed herself to be yanked out of this hospital in uniform, she would blow the entire operation. 6 months of work. 17 confirmed victims. And potentially dozens more. She couldn't break cover. Not yet. She walked to the staff locker room in silence, passing nurses who looked away, passing residents who suddenly found their shoes fascinating. The hallway lights buzzed overhead like something dying. Her name badge hung heavy around her neck. St. Michael's Hospital. Temporary nurse. 3 months of being invisible. 3 months of being less than. 3 months of swallowing insults and accepting dismissal and folding her hands like she had no choice in anything. Except she had always had a choice. She had chosen this. She had chosen to walk into this hospital as a ghost because 7 men and women deserved justice. Because a deaf veteran deserved to be treated like a human being and not a liability. Because the system was broken and someone had to fix it from the inside, alone, with nothing but her hands and her training and the kind of patience that only comes from standing watch in the dark for 17 years. The laundry drop room smelled like bleach and steam and the industrial heat of washers running on endless cycle. She folded her scrubs methodically. Each crease perfect. Each fold parallel. The fabric was still warm from her body, still damp with sweat and blood spatter she had not bothered to clean before stripping down. She placed the first pair in the bin. Then the second. Her movements were precise and unhurried, the movements of a woman with nowhere to be and nothing but time. A janitor worked nearby, pushing a mop across tile that squeaked beneath its head like an animal in pain. He watched her. She knew he was watching. She had learned long ago that people always watch the moment when someone broke. The moment when armor came off and the human underneath was visible. Tears ran down her face now, silent and steady, the same way rain ran down a windshield, the same way blood ran down a wall in a place she had promised herself not to think about during working hours. But her hands didn't tremble. Her hands didn't stop their precise work. The folded scrubs went into the bin. One final glance at the hospital badge, Teresa Torres, RN. A fiction. A cover. A name that had been useful and was now discarded like those warm scrubs. She placed it on the counter. She removed her shoes and replaced them with the boots she had worn in. Combat boots, worn at the heel, salt-stained from desert sweat. She had carried these boots through Fallujah, through Sanjin Valley, through 23 years of places most people would never see and didn't want to know existed. She laced them with the same precision she had performed cardiac massage. One loop. One pull. Tighter. The janitor had stopped mopping. He was just standing there, watching this temporary nurse fall apart with perfect composure. She met his eyes for half a second and something passed between them, some recognition that she was not what she appeared to be, that the trembling she did not allow herself was somehow more powerful than any scream could be. The parking lot was brutal. Houston heat, the kind that pressed down on skin like a physical force. Her car was a grey sedan, anonymous, rented under an alias that was not her cover identity and was not her real name either. She sat in the driver's seat for 7 minutes without starting the engine. Her hands gripped the wheel at 2 and 10 o'clock. The air conditioning did not work. She did not turn it on. She just sat there in the heat and thought about a man named Diego Reyes who was now stable in a recovery room. His heart was beating. His lungs were inflating. His brain was getting oxygen because a nurse, a temporary nurse with no authority and no standing, had performed a procedure that the attending surgeon was too frightened to attempt. 20 doctors had refused him. 20. The number had sat in Rachel's briefing file like an indictment of the entire system. But one nurse had said yes. One nurse had walked into his room and seen a human being instead of a problem. One nurse had folded his combat boots like they were sacred. And now those doctors would spend the rest of their careers knowing that a temporary nurse with an online degree, that was what they whispered about her, what Whitfield had insinuated during grand rounds, had saved a life they had abandoned. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the operation was still active. The fraud ring was still intact. The billing falsifications were still happening. And she had just been removed from the hospital that was the epicenter of the entire scheme. She started the engine. She did not cry on the drive home, even though tears continued to run down her face with the kind of mechanical inevitability of a heart monitor that would not stop beeping. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer. She had learned a long time ago that tears were just salt water leaving the body. They meant nothing. They changed nothing. They saved no one. 36 hours later, everything changed. The convoy arrived at St. Michael's main entrance at exactly 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning, 36 hours after Rachel's security badge had been deactivated. 3 black SUVs in perfect formation, followed by a personnel transport with government plates. The rotor wash from a Black Hawk helicopter circling overhead shook the windows of the administrative wing. Hospital staff stopped moving. Phones came out. The morning broke open like a door that couldn't be closed again. 2 soldiers in full dress uniform, navy dress blues, creased sharp enough to cut paper, walked directly through the main lobby toward the administrative offices. They didn't check in at reception. They didn't ask for directions. Their movements had the terrifying fluid precision of men trained to breach doorways and extract targets. The taller one, a petty officer first class with a Navy Cross ribbon on his chest, approached the security desk where a veteran guard in his 60s was checking visitor badges. "We need Chief Torres," the soldier said. "By her call sign. Now." The guard's face went pale. He'd worked at St. Michael's for 34 years. He'd never heard of any Chief Torres working in nursing. He pulled up the employee directory with shaking hands. "There's no Master Chief Petty Officer Torres," the other soldier corrected. "SEAL Team 3. Charlie Platoon. She was terminated from this facility yesterday on fabricated charges." The guard's hand stopped moving. He looked at the soldiers, then at the Navy uniforms, then at the helicopter still circling above the building. His voice, when it came, wasn't quiet. It wasn't meant to be. He stood up from his desk and spoke loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. That temp nurse who was here 3 months, she's a Master Chief Petty Officer. A Navy SEAL. The lobby had gone quiet. 2 visitors stopped walking. A doctor entering through the main doors froze mid-stride. Phones appeared. The guard's voice carried across the atrium like a bell tolling. The one they fired yesterday? She's decorated. Within the hour, a 3-star general walked through those same doors. Rear Admiral James Holloway, Deputy Commander Naval Special Warfare Command, wore his dress uniform with the weight of actual authority, not the institutional kind that came from a title on a door, but the kind earned through command of men's lives and deaths. His aide carried a leather portfolio. Behind him came 2 FBI agents in dark suits and a woman from the Pentagon's Office of Inspector General. The hospital board had been hastily assembled in the executive conference room on the 4th floor. Dr. Whitfield stood at the far end of the table, his face already the color of wet newspaper. Board members flanked him like nervous birds. The general entered without knocking. "Gentlemen," Holloway said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, capable of sudden acceleration. "I'm here about Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. I'm also here to discuss fraud." He opened the portfolio. Inside lay Rachel's official record, stamped with security clearances and military seals. "For Bronze Stars," the general said, laying the first commendation on the table. 1 board member exhaled slowly. 2 Purple Hearts. Another document followed. The chairman's pen fell from his fingers. 17 combat deployments across a 12-year career. And a Navy Cross awarded for carrying 3 wounded operators across 200 meters of open ground under sustained mortar fire in Tikrit. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. Whitfield's jaw clenched. His hands, gripping the edge of the conference table, had begun to shake. "That patient in your surgical suite," Holloway continued, "the deaf veteran who suffered cardiac arrest during routine surgery. Master Chief Torres performed direct cardiac massage through his open chest cavity when your attending surgeon stepped back. That patient is now stable and walking. He is also," the general paused, checking a document, "currently providing a statement to federal investigators." As if on cue, the door opened. A hospital liaison escorted Diego Reyes into the room, his brother beside him. Diego wore a hospital gown over a blue shirt, his movements careful but steady. His brother stood close, ready to interpret. Through him, Diego's voice came into the room in measured American Sign Language, his hands sharp and precise. "She saved my squad," the brother translated, his voice thick. "In Tikrit. Under fire. Same procedure. Same hands. I recognize the way she moves. That's Chief Torres. That's the medic who pulled me out of the street." He paused. His eyes were wet. "That's the one who saved all of us." The silence lasted exactly 10 full seconds. No one moved. No one breathed. The general waited, letting the weight of those 10 seconds compress the room like a fist. Then the FBI agent stepped forward. Her name was Sarah Chen, special agent in charge of the Healthcare Fraud Task Force. She placed 3 printed emails on the table in front of Dr. Whitfield. "Dr. Whitfield," she began, her voice carrying the precision of someone who had arrested many people, 3 hours after Nurse Torres was dismissed from this facility, you contacted what you believed to be her nursing school requesting her transcripts and certification records. Whitfield's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You attempted to access military personnel files using fraudulent federal credentials, Chen continued. You represented yourself as a compliance officer to a records department. That triggered an automatic flag in our system. She placed another document on the table. You also contacted 3 board members with fabricated performance complaints. You told them Chief Torres was under criminal investigation. That she was falsifying patient records. That she posed a risk to patients. Chen looked directly at the board members now. He made every word up. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman in a charcoal suit, spoke in a voice like winter. "Thomas, you told me she was a danger. I was protecting," Whitfield's voice had cracked. "I was protecting this hospital." "From what?" Holloway's voice cut across the table like a knife. "From a decorated combat veteran who performed an emergency life-saving procedure while you watched." The FBI agent opened a second file. The pages were printed billing records, surgical logs, highlighted sections showing procedure codes and attending physician fees. "What's more relevant to your immediate future, Dr. Whitfield, is this. Chief Torres was placed at St. Michael's under deep cover 6 months ago as part of a federal investigation into veteran benefits fraud. Specifically, procedures billed to the Department of Veterans Affairs that were never performed, or were performed by unqualified residents while you claimed the surgeon fees." Whitfield's face had gone from white to a shade of red that didn't look natural on human skin. "Your surgical logs show 12 cases in the past year," Chen said quietly, "where you billed for procedures you did not personally perform. You assigned them to first-year residents. You collected the fees. That's fraud against the federal government. That's conspiracy. That's approximately $847,000 in false billings. That's standard teaching protocol," Whitfield gasped. His hands had begun to shake noticeably now. "Residents must perform." "Not when you bill as the primary surgeon," Chen interrupted. "Not when you bill the VA for services you didn't provide. Not when you do it 12 times and pocket the difference." 2 federal marshals entered the room. They moved toward Whitfield with the same unhurried precision as the soldiers in the lobby. Whitfield stood, knocking his chair backward so hard it clattered against the wall. The sound made one of the board members flinch. "This is absurd," Whitfield said, his voice climbing. "I have done nothing." The handcuffs clicked onto his wrists with a sound like a gate closing. Metal on metal. Final. His Miranda rights were read in a calm, professional voice while his face cycled through colors, red to purple to a sickly pale. The marshals gripped his elbows and led him out of the conference room, down the hallway past the nursing station where staff watched with their phones recording, through the lobby where the veteran security guard stood with tears on his weathered face, and past the vending machines where Thomas Whitfield had once stood smirking while nurses made coffee, sure of his own untouchable position in the world. The perp walk took 60 seconds. It would circle the internet for weeks. 2 years passed. A nurse named Sarah, who had once worked the evening shift at St. Michael's, was passing through a strip mall in suburban Houston on a Saturday morning. Between a tax preparation office and a Dollar General, she saw a folding table with a vinyl banner overhead in faded blue lettering, "Supplemental Insurance, Affordable Plans." Behind the table sat Dr. Thomas Whitfield. His suit was cheap polyester, the kind sold at outlet stores. His tie hung crooked from his neck. His hands, which had once commanded surgical suites, now held pamphlets about health coverage. He was explaining deductible structures to a customer who looked desperately uninterested. Sarah recognized him, stared for a moment, then walked quickly away. He never looked up. 6 months later, in Washington, D.C., the East Room of the White House gleamed in afternoon sunlight. The Presidential Citizens Medal ceremony was a formal affair, military families, federal officials, hospital administrators who had flown in to witness, the general, Rachel's operational commanders, and Diego Reyes standing in his Navy dress uniform despite the lingering pain in his chest. Rachel Torres stood at attention while the president placed the medal around her neck. The ribbon was silk. The medal was bronze and silver, heavy with significance. The room rose in applause, a sound like a wave breaking on shore, sustained and genuine. Beside her stood Diego, his worn combat boots polished to a mirror shine, each scuff mark and crease lovingly restored. He saluted her with the respect of one warrior for another. She saluted back. "Chief Torres," the president said, extending his hand. "Your country is grateful." Rachel stepped to a microphone, her voice steady and quiet, carrying the tone of someone who had learned composure in the worst possible circumstances. "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." Diego's interpreter signed her words. The deaf veteran signed his response, and his brother translated. She watched when no one else would. The camera pulled back to show them both, the medic and the patient, the rescuer and the rescued, standing together in the formal light of the White House, medals bright against dark blue, two people who had found each other across impossible odds and refused to accept that refusal meant no. The applause continued for a long time. Did you ever wonder if the most dangerous person in a room might be the one nobody's looking at? If you've ever been underestimated or had your qualifications questioned, let me know in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the assumptions we make about people based on their title or their appearance, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to know that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform you can recognize. Sometimes it wears scrubs.